there were no holes in that theory. I absolutely believe that you proved it.
Oh yeah, we did. It's just getting people to acknowledge that we proved it is another matter. This is normal in scholarship and science, and anybody who's involved in any kind of major heresy better understand that you have a whole field of people whose hearts and souls are bound up in their own expertise, and then anybody who challenges, particularly an outsider like myself, who challenges the very basis of everything that they believe is in for a rough ride. So anyway.
So what you're saying is that some minds are just like concrete. They're thoroughly mixed and permanently set.
This is standard. I mean, most advances in science and scholarship almost always come from heretics who, more often than not, are not part of the establishment. That's just, again, this is another couple of hours of talk to back up that statement. But anyway, so it took a long time before I finally found Robert Schoch. And I mean, I developed the theory, but then Schoch, this is another long story. One of these days, I hope to do an autobiography telling this whole story. Actually, on my website, which is jawest.com or jawest.net, I do audio blogs. I don't do them very often because I'm so inefficient, and a combination of inefficiency and overworked is not a great combination for getting a lot of work done. But I do these Phoenix Fire audio blogs, and if you pull up the website, you'll see right on the homepage, Phoenix Fire. And there are 10 long hour and a half, 2-hour discussions of various Egypt-related subjects. And one of them, I tell this long story about the mystery of the Sphinx and getting Charlton Heston aboard and all of the trials and tribulations that we've had to go through in order to back this theory up. Anyway, long and short of it was that finally, after being very, very skeptical at first, Schoch endorsed the theory wholeheartedly, and he's a absolutely qualified a geologist and geophysicist with a PhD from Yale, and he teaches geology in Boston University. At that time, he was a youngish man. At this time now, 20 years later, he's not that youngish anymore, nor am I. And but Schoch backed it up, and we gave a presentation at what's effectively the Super Bowl of geology. It's called the Geological Society of America's annual meeting. This was 91. We presented our evidence, which was headlines all over the world. Well, we was really getting abused and attacked by the quackademics, but the geologists were 100% on board, and that led eventually to the documentary that you saw, the one hosted by Charlton Heston, and the argument has been raging ever since, sometimes simmering and sometimes boiling over. And we now have, and then in the ensuing 10 years, Schoch and I really uncovered and refined our evidence so that we have much more that wasn't in that original documentary, which is available, actually. I think you can get it. You go online, or people can email me, and I have copies and can send them to people. So we have lots more evidence that we again presented at a GSA meeting in 2000, again to the almost unanimous support of the attending geologists. And unfortunately, at that presentation in Reno, Nevada, there was almost no press present, so it didn't make any kind of a PR splash. Which was too bad, because if it had made a lot of noise, we would have been able to do our sequel with all of this new evidence. Anyway, that didn't happen, and now it's 10 years have gone by since then. But now we have what's really the smoking gun in terms of evidence, because one of the arguments they used against us, the academics, was that, well, of course, the hell with the geology. We don't care about geology. We're Egyptologists, so we don't have to know anything about geology. And It's impossible that your theory is correct because prior to the rise of ancient Egypt, there was no sophisticated civilization at all. I mean, it was all hunter-gatherers and little Neolithic settlements and that sort of thing. So here you have the Sphinx, which is unquestionably the most spectacular sculpture on Earth, and the temples around it, as you know, having visited them, in a way are even more spectacular, not in terms of, let's say, artistic mastery, but in terms of architectural mastery, because they're built of these gigantic blocks of stone that weigh 50, 75, 100 tons, slotted into place like pieces on a jigsaw puzzle. And if our theory is correct, and it is, it means that not only was the most spectacular sculpture on Earth created at a time when there's not supposed to be any civilization at all, but that civilization was in possession of a technology that even today we can't emulate. Believe it or not, we can fly to the moon, but given the technology at our disposal, we could not produce, we could not reproduce the temples immediately in front of and adjacent to the Sphinx. Now, if it were important to us, we could probably figure out a way to do it. But it's not important to us. It's much more important to fly to the moon and to produce bobblehead dolls. But so the fact is, I mean, plain fact, is that we couldn't do those temples today. So you can see what this theory entails, because on the one hand, you have symbolist Egypt, which means it's a highly developed scientific, it's a civilization based upon a sacred science that manages to last for 3,000 years. And this civilization itself, somehow, and we don't know, see, there's a big long period, a hiatus in between, how the one segues into the other. There seem to be thousands of years between whenever the Sphinx was built, because we're convinced that it's built at least 10,000 BC and maybe a lot older than that. And then there's this big space in between, and we can't answer that. We admit there's a big space, but the geology is the geology, and there we are. And then now, as I said, smoking gun. A few years ago, we heard about this find in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, not too far from the Syrian border. And this is a remarkable, it was a May issue of the National Geographic. It was the lead story in the May of this year, 2011. Lead story in the National Geographic, and it was beautiful photographs, not a very, not the world's best article, because it didn't actually get into the implications of this extraordinary find. But anyway, without going into a big long song and dance about Göbekli Tepe, it was discovered by accident around, I think, 1994, and it's been under excavation since '94 under the leadership of an absolutely orthodox academic, very intelligent and careful, meticulous German archaeologist called Klaus Schmidt, and it's only about 5% of this extraordinary site has 5% of this site has been excavated, but a lot more of the site has been surveyed via ground penetrating radar and seismographs and so on. And what it is it's this enormous it's a hill with, so far, excavated 4 closely adjacent stone circles looking rather like mini Stonehenges. Not that many. I mean, Stonehenge, the giant stones of Stonehenge weigh 30, 40 tons. And these mini Stonehenges at Göbekli Tepe, the central pillars, the T-shaped pillars, weigh between 10 and 15 tons. But they're very finely cut, very finely dressed, and they're covered with extraordinarily beautiful raised relief carvings of animals and birds and insects and different kinds of symbolic and geometric reliefs and figurations. And here's the cruncher: they're in incredibly good shape because the whole site, and the only 4 have been excavated, and even those not entirely, but they know that there are another at least 18 of these stone circles on this site, and they were deliberately covered over, carefully covered over, when they're complete, around 8,000 BC. And so
8,000 BC.
8,000 BC. So again, this is Schmidt's dating, and Jacques and I were over there last year, looking at this site and talking with Schmidt to convince ourselves that he really knew what he was talking about, because this is a bombshell to archaeology, and nobody's arguing about the dating. What they're doing is they're carefully not acknowledging that this upsets their entire paradigm. I mean, everything has to be written because of Göbekli Tepe. Actually, it should have been written because of the Sphinx, but because that was geology and not archaeology, they could get away with pretending that we were incorrect. But nobody's arguing about Göbekli Tepe, and if they were covered over deliberately for reasons we absolutely don't understand, nobody knows why, but it's quite clear it was deliberate. Because they were covered over deliberately, once it's excavated, everything is in practically perfect condition. It's really amazing. You have no idea what a fantastic place this is. And so Schmidt dates the actual site itself to at least 10,000 BC. And it is all hunter-gatherers back then. And they were not houses. Nobody knows what the thing was for. Jacques and I are convinced that it's astronomical, that these stone circles have an astrological significance, but we can't prove it yet. Schmidt doesn't think that for reasons of his own, but the jury's still out on it. But nobody's arguing about the dating. So what this does is, for our purposes, it precludes. It means that nobody can argue anymore that the Sphinx, that the reason the Sphinx can't be as old as we say it is because it's all hunter-gatherers back then. Maybe they were hunter-gatherers, but they sure could whip around 10 and 15-ton blocks of stone and carve them with these extraordinary reliefs. Actually, anybody interested in this should Google up Göbekli Tepe. It's spelled Goebekli, and the other word Tepe, Tepe. And there's a lot of stuff there, and you'll find all of the different articles in the Smithsonian and all sorts of places. So anyway, this is our smoking gun, and now Jacques and I are looking to do the sequel to our Mystery of the Sphinx. And we thought we had the money together, but our money evaporated on us, unfortunately. So now we have to look further, and we want to do it as a big gala theatrical release, sort of like, have it on, maybe not necessarily on IMAX, but not television. Television's changed since we did ours was an NBC special and prime time and won an Emmy and all that stuff. But now, really, television is much decimated, and the internet has taken over, and cable has made its inroads. So we want to, if we can, get the money together to start it off in theaters as a movie, and then move it onto television, and then move it onto DVDs and and the internet and all of that. So that's the plan. But
all right, John.
Yeah.
We're coming up on a break. Let's take a break.
Okay.
And when we come back,
okay,
we can continue for another 6 hours if we had it.
Well, you've been with me for a couple of weeks. We can do it for 2 weeks, and I'm still always rushing to get all the material in. All right. Well, we'll take a little break and come back with John Anthony West. Thank you. Thank you, Leena. We're on! Oh, my goodness. Yes, we are. We're always on. Miracles of modern technology. Here we are. Here we are back with John Anthony West and Epic Radio. One thing before we get into that great story about you just being back in Egypt, wanted to mention that Epic now has a youth group. Yes. And
This is to develop the leaders of the future. Hopefully we'll have a future. And if there's anybody out there who is under 21 and interested, you can contact Ken Cherry at epic.2010@yahoo.com or on the Epic website. Visit us on Epic Voyages on Facebook or YouTube. We're all over the place. And so now we'll go back to John Anthony West. And John,
yes,
please tell us, you just got back from Egypt. You were there for the whole revolution.
Well, that's a while back. So I didn't just get back. I got back when the revolution was over. But yes, I was there with a group, and it just happened that way. And we arrived, let's see, what was it? I think the 25th of January. It was the 26th. We left New York 25th. I went a day early with a few people from the group because I like to get there a day early to de-jet lag before the trip actually starts because, as you know, Leena, it's a grueling trip. We're up crack of dawn and at the sites and so on. So anyway, a day early, and the protests had just started. And so we were there, I guess they started the 25th. We were there on the 26th, and so a lot of stuff was going on. But when we got in on the 26th and into the airport, it was still, it was still functioning. I mean, we knew there was stuff going on. We were hearing about it, but we got out of the airport to our hotel without any particular problem, and we were staying on your trip. When was your trip, Leena?
99.
99. Oh, so it was before 9/11 and stuff. Were we staying at the Mina House?
Yes, we were at the Mina House.
Yeah, right. Well, you know the Mina House. It's one of the great hotels of the world. So there we were at the Mina House, and this was a study group, a very interesting group called the Enneagram Institute, teaching kind of based upon the Gurdjieff work, which is my own, for lack of a better word, spiritual teaching or spiritual focus. And so this was a dedicated group, everybody involved in this teaching. And we were at the Mina House, and my friend who was actually running the leader of the group, had booked a suite at the Mina House. And the suites of the Mina House are not to be believed. They look like something out of a Cecil B. DeMille movie of the 1001 Nights. I mean, with the pyramids in the background and this incredible suite. And so we were there with the few of us who got there early. The rest of the group hadn't got there yet, and we're watching all of this stuff going on television. But I mean, by this time it's already, you can see that this is serious. And but we are in this wonderful suite with lots of champagne and plenty of vodka and a certain illegal substance that's not too difficult to procure in Egypt. And we're watching all of this stuff going on, saying, holy mackerel, are we going to be able to do this trip? And we don't know. And the next day is when the rest of the group arrives, but they get stuck at the airport. By this time, it's full-blown revolution. And the government and the press are saying, get out of Egypt while the getting's good, blah, 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 blah. And the U.S. government issued a warning. And this, to me, was the signal. And then finally, actually, they were marooned. The airport was shut down because the protests were going on all over the place, and the streets are full of tanks. And the rest of the group is stuck in the airport. But we have one of our very savvy guys who's running, who's there, my rep there, and he manages to sneak everybody out because they're not letting tourists out because they think their people are going to be shooting at us. Actually, they're not, because they don't care. They like us there. And but he sneaks everybody out in a blacked out van, and they stay at the hotel overnight, one of the airport hotels, and they get to the hotel. They get to our hotel. Did they get out that day? No, they stay in the hotel, and then they get to us in the morning, I guess. We meanwhile are busy drinking lots of vodka and watching all of the revolution going on television, CNN, BBC, and so on, and listening to all these dire warnings. And yeah, the tanks are on the streets and the tear gas and all of this stuff is going on, but not at the Meena House, where it's going on in the street outside the Meena House. But we're okay, although the bullets are zinging around and we can smell the tear gas, and it's not a normal Egypt trip. And
you know what? I was really worried about you.
Lots of people were, and everybody laughed because once it got cooking, wait, I'll tell you about all of this, because then the question came up, okay, all the group got there. A couple of people actually didn't make it because they got stuck in Minnesota because of the blizzards going on. So they couldn't have got there for the trip anyhow. And one guy who was a Navy guy had to go back, some government thing. He had to go back. Anyway, the group, what should have been 20 people, was reduced to 15, but we're all there. And then the question comes up, well, they're telling the government, they're saying all Americans have to clear out if you're not out in a day or two. We're not responsible for you. And people were camped out in the airport. I mean, it was an absolute scene of total chaos. With thousands of people in the airport, and of course no facilities for them, and no food, and no water, no anything. And the planes, nobody was sure where the planes were going. And we're watching all of this happening from our suite in the Meena House. And they're telling us we should get out of there. We look at this, and I'm saying to myself, the hell with them, I'm not going to leave the Meena House to get in the middle of this. And I have a kind of a rule, actually. Well, I have a set of rules about dealing with the Church of Progress. And rule number 1 is the government is your enemy. Rule number 2 is there's nothing the government won't do. There's nothing so despicable and heinous that the government will not commit it in order to gain or retain power. And the third is assume the government is lying until proved otherwise. Rule 3A is if the government is apprehended telling the truth, look for the ulterior motive. So I'm watching all of this stuff going on and saying, I don't want to do what the government says we're supposed to do. And Mohammed Nazmi, who I think you remember, who runs our trips,
yes,
he's a very sagacious and lovely man, and he's saying, we'll manage. And so we hold, we do a vote. Who wants to go back and suffer through all of this airport crap, and who wants to take a chance and see if this thing calms down a little bit, and we can go and do our trip. Maybe we'll miss a couple of places, or some places, or all the places. We don't know. But anyway, everybody decides we'll take a chance. So we do, and within a couple of days, we're stuck in the hotel. I mean, you have to be stuck somewhere in Egypt. Let it be the Meena House. And all the tourists have gone. We're the only people in the whole Meena House, and we're watching all of this going on. And there's a curfew on, so we can't even get out of the hotel. Well, we can by day, but we have to get back by 5 in the evening. Okay, that could be a lot worse. And within a couple of days, however, the planes are flying again, and the temples and the sites are opening up. And so we go, and a couple of places we couldn't get into, the museum with Tahrir Square, that's getting looted and that's shut. But otherwise, practically everything is open, and we're getting special permissions everywhere because there's nobody there. We're the only tourists in Egypt. I think we saw 1 or 2 along the way who stuck it out, foreigners, from Sweden or something, other, not Americans, but only a couple of tourists. Now, you were there with me, and I don't remember what time of the year, and I don't remember if it was one of the most crowded times, but Egypt is normally, one of the big problems with Egypt under normal circumstances is trying to get some peace and quiet in these wonderful places because, we're up at, you've been with me, going to extraordinary lengths to get there first at 6 o'clock in the morning or to get there at lunch when everybody leaves. But to experience Egypt with nobody there is not to be believed. And
Oh, I remember. I remember very well, particularly at Abu Simbel at midnight. And I often wondered, how much bakshish does it take to get that privilege?
well, normally it took a lot, but then once 9/11 happened, it became impossible because then they got so antsy about the security. So you got one of the last times. But now, of course, see now, so anyway, we have Egypt all to ourselves, and then Mohammed has this wonderful boat. It's the best boat on the Nile. It's not a big, giant 50-cabin boat. It's a private sailing yacht with 8 cabins on it, so maximum of 16 people. And it's called a dahabeya. It's the descendant of the ancient Egyptian boats that used to have a sail, and it still has a sail, and used to have lots of oarsmen to row it when the wind wasn't right, and now they don't have oarsmen anymore, but the boat still doesn't have an engine when the wind isn't right, which it often isn't. There's a little tug that pushes you up the river. But normally, I mean, I stopped doing cruises, in fact, a few years back, because there were so many boats on the river that it was like, it was like a river version of a, of one of the Los Angeles freeways. I mean, that's not the way to see Egypt, and it was more expensive, and it was, I mean, who needs it? Who needs 300 boats on the Nile all blowing their horns and stuff like that? So I stopped doing the trips. But now we were the only in this fabulous high-end boat that normally costs a few $1,000s more per person to take it. I mean, very high-end trips take it, but the group that had booked it canceled out. So Mohammed, rather than keep the boat empty, gave it to, and he's, we're very good personal friends. So we had the boat for no extra cost. And there we are sailing up the Nile in this gorgeous weather with no other people, tourists, in all of Egypt. And I mean, it was absolutely a magical experience. And then we were getting into places that are normally shut to the public because, Mohammed was a good friend of Zahi Hawass, who was still in power at that time. And, was happy to give us permission to go anywhere that we wanted because there was nobody there, and why not? So we got into all kinds of places that even I had not been in myself for 10, 12 years or more. And that was our trip, and we got back eventually to Egypt. We still, the big miss, we couldn't get into the museum because protests were still going on. But by this time it was, I forget what the day it was, 13th of February, 12th, 13th, something like that. And we couldn't get into the museum, but otherwise everything else was the Giza Plateau. Everything was open for us, pyramid meditation, all of that. And then just on that day, they got Mubarak out of there, and we had to wait an extra day because nobody was sure about the airport being open and all of that. So we had an extra day. Oh, terrible thing it was at the Mina House, and off we went. So we were there for the entire revolution, and I'm telling the story at much more length on my Phoenix Fire audio blog. It's the last one, episode 10, called The 5-Star Revolution. That was our experience. And then you were getting all of this baloney. I mean, if you want commentary on it. What's the name of our host here? I didn't catch his name. Who lived in Egypt? Your friend there, Leena? What's his name?
Joe.
What, Joe?
Yes.
No. Well, Joe, I mean, he's been there. He was living there, he said, for a year.
That's right.
So he knows what's involved in Egypt. And they're making all of this fuss about democracy and all of this and getting rid of the terrible dictator. But this is a bunch of rubbish. Yes, there's a dictator. As dictators go on a scale of, let's say, 1 to 10, he's maybe a 3.5 dictator. I mean, a long way from a Stalin or a Kim Jong-il or one of the other really monster guys.
John?
Yeah, it's corrupt. What?
We are getting some very, very fascinating questions from some of our listeners. I want to read to you a couple of them.
Okay, well, we can cut it off now. All right.
All right. This one comes from Richard. He says, Thutmose III killed and conquered from Syria to Nubia 350 cities, 16 raids in 20 years. Was this the action of a civilization higher than ours? And then he also comments that, but it still would help if some other evidence of early civilization would be found in Egypt. Evidence for an old sphinx is compelling, but it does seem strange that these builders seem to have built only one thing, the Sphinx complex.
Oh, no, not at all. There's tons of more evidence all over the Giza Plateau and other places in Egypt as well. This was the evidence we presented in our second presentation before the GSA in 2000. Lots of other instances of water weathering, lots of instances of technologies that shouldn't be there. The Osirion, which you must have visited with us, Leena, at Abydos, which almost certainly dates from an earlier period. It's stylistically completely impossible to have built it at the time when it's supposed to have been built in the New Kingdom, and so on. So there's loads of evidence, and also there's lots more evidence from around the world. There's Göbekli Tepe, and as I said, the chances are, in fact, in Egypt that there's more there too, except that nobody's been looking in the right places, which are probably in the floodplain and maybe very deep down in the silt.
Starlight is saying, does Mr. West believe that there is a room with the Sphinx pod that contains ancient information on a library?
Well, we don't know, but actually our seismograph tells us that there's some sort of a chamber or something exactly in that area. The problem is that it's under about 15 feet of bedrock, and the water table has risen over the thousands of years, so that whatever it is that's there, I mean, the academics say that, oh no, it can't be that, it's got to be a natural feature. It's called a karst feature, a cavern, a fissure in the bedrock, and so it shows up that way by the seismograph shows it as though it looks like a room. We think otherwise, and so does our geophysicist Tom DeBecke, who did the seismograph work. However, it's next to impossible to. They could, if they wanted, maybe the new guy who's replaced Zahi is more open-minded about such things, but that's unlikely, actually. We don't know till I get to meet him. But they could drill down there and put in fiber optic cameras, those little fiber optic cameras, to see what's there. But since it's almost certainly